All right, guys, today we're going to be reading Chapter 12 of The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Before we get there, it's important that you familiarize yourselves with a little bit of the vocabulary that we're going to come into contact in this chapter. So, from the agenda slide, you can go ahead and hop to slide 49 here. A couple of terms you should know. Huck and Jim are going to come across an abandoned steamboat, okay? Well, Texas is referred to in this chapter, and that's a steamboat area that has what they call the pilot house in it, and the crew's quarters. Well, the pilot house itself is also what they would call or refer to as the wheelhouse. It's kind of like a glass enclosure where the captain would control the boat. When they say port and starboard, that is referring to directions of the boat or parts of the boat, either the left or the right. The starboard derrick is going to be the thing that they use to hoist the right side of the ship. When they refer to berth, and I actually think that this comes in a later chapter, but just in case, when they're referring to a berth, that would be a bed, like bunk beds. They're all stacked on top of one another. Or if you're using it as a verb, like if you were to give something a wide berth, that would refer to like park a boat or settle it in. The additional vocabulary words I've provided images for because I think that helps us see what's going on in the book. For instance, they will tie their canoe or tie it up to a towhead, which would be like a small river island. They use cottonwood branches to kind of secure and hide their canoe or their raft. This is cottonwood. You also hear terminology referring to wigwams and teepees, of course, Native American housing. Jim and Huck actually build a wigwam in this chapter. And they talk about persimmons. Now in the book they say persimmons. Again, we see that apostrophe taking place of a letter here, but persimmons is a fruit. And then, that's about it, guys. So let's go ahead and dive ourselves into Chapter 12. I'll stop and discuss a few things as needed. Just please make sure that you are following along. For those of y'all at home, remember the PDF of the text is on the agenda slide. You can just click here and you have access to that. All right, here we go. Chapter 12. Remember, at the end of Chapter 11, Huck and Jim have successfully fled their island, trying to make sure that they both, as Huck says, that they both don't get caught. They are protecting one another. Well, it must have been close to 1 o'clock when we got below the island at last, and the raft did seem to go mighty slow. If a boat was coming along, we were going to take the canoe right for the Illinois shore, and it was well a boat didn't come, for we had never thought to put the gun in the canoe, or a fishing line, or anything to eat. We was in rather too much a sweat to think of so many things. It warn't good judgment to put everything in the raft. Well, if the men went to the island, I just expect they found the campfire I built and watched it all night for Jim to come. Anyways, they stayed away from us, and if my building the fire never fooled them, it warn't no fault of mine. I played it as low down on them as I could. Well, when the first streak of day begun to show, we tied up to a towhead and a big bend in the Illinois side and hacked off cottonwood branches with the hatchet and covered up the raft with them so as to look like it had been in a cave, there had been a cave in the bank there. A towhead is a sandbar that has cottonwoods on it as thick as harrow teeth. Well, we had mountains on the Missouri shore and heavy timber on the Illinois side, and the channel was down the Missouri shore at that place, so we weren't afraid of anybody running across us. We laid there all day and watched the rafts and steamboats spin down the Missouri shore and upbound steamboats fight the big river in the middle. I told Jim all about time I was jabbering with that woman. Jim said she was a smart one, and if she was to start after us herself, she wouldn't have settled down and watched a campfire. No, sir, she'd fetch a dog. Well, then, I said, why couldn't she tell her husband to fetch a dog? Jim said the best he'd think that at the time that the men was ready to start, and he believed they must have gone to town to get a dog, and so they lost all that time, or else we wouldn't be here on a towhead 16 or 17 miles below the village. No, indeedy, we would be in that same old town again. So I said I didn't care what the reason was they didn't get us, as long as they didn't. Here we see again him referring to the two of them, like a team. When it was beginning to come on dark, we poked our heads out of the cottonwood thicket to looked up, down, and across. Nothing in sight. So Jim took some of the top planks of the raft and built a snug wigwam to get under in blazing weather and rainy, and to keep the things dry. Well, Jim made a floor for the wigwam and raised it a foot or more above the level of the raft, so now the blankets and the traps were all out of the reach of the steamboat waves. Right in the middle of the wigwam, we made a layer of dirt about 5 or 6 inches deep with the frame around it for it to hold its place. This was to build a fire on in sloppy weather or chilly. Well, the wigwam would keep it from being seen. We made an extra steering oar, too, because one of the others might get broke or snag on something. We fixed up a short forked stick to hang the old lantern on, because we must always light the lantern whenever we see a steamboat coming downstream, to keep from getting run over. But we wouldn't have to light it for upstream boats unless we see that there was a call for a crossing, for the river was pretty high yet, very low banks being still a little under water. So upbound boats didn't always run the channel, but hunted easy water. So here we're learning a little bit more about the setup that Jim and Huck have on their river raft. And you can see here in the image that I've included on this page here, they've got themselves their flat raft, and Jim has now built a wigwam on top of that to keep them safe and kept from water. They've made a pretty comfortable spot for themselves and have a real good plan if they're to come across a steamboat. Well, this second night, we run between 7 and 8 hours with a current that was making over 4 miles an hour. We catched fish and talked, and we took a swim now and then to keep off sleepiness. It was kind of solemn, drifting down the big still river, laying on our backs looking up at stars, and we didn't ever feel like talking loud, and it weren't often that we laughed, only a little kind of low chuckle. We had mighty good weather as a general thing, and nothing ever happened to us at all, that night, nor the next, nor the next. Well, every night we passed towns, some of them away on a black hillsides, nothing but shiny beds of lights, and not a house you could see. The fifth night we passed St. Louis, and it was like the whole world lit up. In St. Petersburg, they used to say that there was 20 or 30,000 people in St. Louis, but I never believed it till I see that wonderful spread of lights at 2 o'clock that still at night. There warn't a sound there. Everybody was asleep. Every night now, I used to slip ashore towards 10 o'clock at some little village and buy 10 or 15 cents worth of meal or bacon or other stuff to eat. And sometimes I lifted a chicken that warn't roosting comfortable and took him along. Pap always said, take a chicken when you get a chance, because if you don't want him yourself, you can easy find somebody that does, and a good deed ain't ever forgot. I never see Pap when he didn't want the chicken himself, but that is what he used to say anyway. Think about that here for a moment, the lesson that Huck learned from his Pap. We've talked a little bit about how Pap raised Huck, or how we expected or we figured that Pap raised Huck, and here he is telling him that it's a good idea to steal things that don't belong to you, and perhaps if you don't want them right off, you could sell them. Well, ask yourself, is that really a good or tolerable lesson to learn? Huck seems to recall it. Well, mornings before daylight, I slipped into cornfields and borrowed a watermelon, or a mushmelon, or a pumpkin, or some new corn, or things of that kind. Notice he says, I borrowed these things. Borrowed? He have any intention of giving those back? Well, Pap always said it warn't no harm to borrow things if you was meaning to pay them back sometime. But the widow said it warn't anything but a soft name for stealing, and no decent body would do it. Jim said he reckoned the widow was partly right and Pap was partly right. So it's the best way to be sure to pick out 2 or 3 things from the list, say we wouldn't borrow them anymore. Then he reckoned it wouldn't be no harm to borrow the others. So we talked it over all one night, drifted along down the river, trying to make up our minds whether to drop the watermelons, or the cantaloupes, or the mushmelons, or what. But towards daylight, we got it all satisfactory and concluded to drop the crab apples and persimmons. We weren't feeling just right before that, but it was still all comfortable now. I was glad the way it came out, too, because crab apples ain't very good, and the persimmons wouldn't be ripe for 2 or 3 months yet. We shot a waterfowl now and then and got up too early in the morning and didn't go to bed early enough in the evening. Take it all around, we lived pretty high. The fifth night below St. Louis, we had a big storm after midnight with a power of thunder and lightning, and the rain poured down in a solid sheet. We stayed in the wigwam and let the raft take care of itself. When the lightning glared out, we'd see a big straight river overhead and high rocky bluffs on both sides. By and by, says I, Hello, Jim, looky yonder. It was a steamboat that had killed herself on a rock. Well, we was drifting straight down for her. The lightning showed her very distinct. She was leaning over with part of her upper deck above water, and you could see every little chimbley guy clean and clear, and a chair by the big bell with old slouch, hat, hanging on the back of it when it flashes come. Well, it being away in the night and stormy and also mysterious like, I felt just the way any other boy would have felt when they saw that wreck laying there so mournful and lonesome in the middle of the river. I wanted to get aboard of her and slink around a while and see what there was. Now think back to the frame house that we saw Jim and Huck get on top of way back, well, a couple chapters back. Ask yourself what it is Huck really intends to do here. Again, we see that adventurous spirit. He can't just be content floating along the river with Jim. Nah, he's got to go and have himself an adventure. Let's land on her, Jim. But Jim was dead against it. At first, he says, I don't want to go fooling along no wreck. We's doing blame well, and we better keep blame well alone. And the good book says, like as they's a watchman on that wreck. Watchman, your grandmother, I says. There ain't nothing to watch but the Texas and the pilot house. And do you reckon anybody's going to risk his life for a Texas and a pilot house such a night as this, when it's likely to break up and wash down the river any minute? Jim couldn't say nothing to that, so he didn't try. And besides, I said, we might borrow something worth having out of the captain's stateroom. Cigars, I bet you. And cost 5 cents apiece, solid cash. Steamboat captains is always rich and get $60 a month, and they don't care a cent what a thing costs, long as they want it. Stick a candle in your pocket. I can't rest, Jim, till we give her a rummaging. Do you reckon Tom Sawyer would ever go buy this thing? Not for pie, he wouldn't. He'd call it an adventure. That's what he'd call it. And he'd laying on that wreck as if it was his last act. And wouldn't he throw style into it? Wouldn't he spread himself nor nothing? Why, you'd think that it was Christopher Columbus discovering Kingdom Come. Oh, I wish Tom Sawyer was here. Jim grumbled a little, but give in. He said we mustn't talk any more, that we talk any more than we could help, and then talk mighty low. The lightning showed us the wreck again just in time, and we fetched the starboard derrick and made it fast there. The deck was high out here. We went sneaking around the slope of the larboard in the dark toward the Texas, feeling our way slow with our feet, spreading our hands out to fend off the guys, for it was so dark we couldn't see no sign of 'em. Pretty soon we struck the forward end of the skylight and clumb onto it, and the next step fetched us in the front of the captain's door, which was open. And by Jiminy, away down to the Texas Hall we see a light, and all in the same second we seemed to hear lower voices in yonder. Jim whispered and said that he was feeling powerful sick, and told me to come along. He's feeling powerful sick. Consider how Jim's really feeling here. I says, all right, and was going to start for the raft, but just then I heard a voice wail out and say, Oh, please don't, boys. I swear I won't ever tell. Another voice said pretty loud, It's a lie, Jim Turner. You've acted this way before. You always want more than your share of the truck, and you've always got it, too. Because you swore, didn't you, tell? But this time you said it just one time too many. You're the meanest, treacherous hound in this country. Well, by this time Jim was gone for the raft. Well, I was just about him with curiosity. I says to myself, Tom Sawyer wouldn't back out now, and so I won't either. I'm going to go see what's going on here. So I dropped on my hands and knees in this little passage and crept aft in the dark till there warn't but about a stateroom betwixt me and the cross hall of the Texas. Then, in there, I see a man stretched on the floor and tied hand and foot, and 2 men standing over him, and one of them had a dim lantern in his hand, and the other one had a pistol. This one kept pointing the pistol at the man's head on the floor, saying, I'd like to, and I ought to, I mean skunk. The man on the floor would shrivel up and say, Oh, please, don't, Bill. I ain't ever gonna tell. And every time he said that, the man with the lantern would laugh and say, Deed, you ain't. You never been truer thing than that, I bet you. And once he said, Hear him beg. And yet if we got the best of him and tied him, he'd have killed us both. And what for? Just for nothing. Just 'cause we stood on our rights, that's what's for. But I lay you ain't going to threaten nobody no more, Jim Turner. Put up that pistol, Bill. Bill says, I don't want to, Jake Packard. I'm for killing him. And he didn't kill old Hatfield just the same way. Don't he deserve it? But I don't want him killed. And I've got my reasons for it. Bless your heart for them words, Jake Packard. I'll forget you for it as long as I live, says the man on the floor, sort of blubbering. Packard didn't take no notice of that, but hung up his lantern on a nail and started towards where I was, there in the dark, and motioned Bill to come. I crawfished as fast as I could, about 2 yards, but the boat slanted, so that I couldn't make very good time. So to keep from getting run over, I catched a crawled into a stateroom on the upper side. The men come a-pawing along in the dark, and when Packer got to my stateroom, he says, "Here, come in here." And in he come, and Bill after him. But before they got in, I was up in the upper berth, cornered, and sorry I came. They stood there with their hands on the ledge of the berth and talked. Well, I couldn't see them, but I could tell where they was by the whiskey they'd been having. I was glad I didn't drink whiskey, but it wouldn't made such a difference. Anyway, because most of the time they much difference. Anyway, because most of the time they couldn't have treated me because I didn't breathe. I was too scared. And besides, a body couldn't breathe and hear such talk. They talked low and earnest. Bill wanted to kill Turner. He said he'll tell, and he will. If we was to give both our shares to him now, it wouldn't make no difference after the row, and after the way we've served him, sure as you're born, he'll turn state's evidence. Now you hear me. I'm for putting him out of his troubles. So am I, says Packard, very quiet. Blame it, I'd have sort of begun to think you wasn't. Well then, that's all right. Let's go and do it. Hold on a minute. I ain't had my say yet. You listen to me. Shooting's good, but there's quite a ways of things that's got to be done. But what I say is this. It ain't good sense to go courting around after Halter. If you can get what you're up to in some way, it's just as good at the end of the same time. Don't bring you much no risks. Ain't that so? You bet it is. But how's you going to manage it this time? Well, my idea is this. Think about it. They're wanting to kill this other guy, but they're not wanting to be too risky about it, especially sending off a big loud gunshot. So what choice do they have? My idea is this. We'll rustle around together and get her whatever pickings we've overlooked in the staterooms and shove ashore and hide the truck. All the time here, guys, truck, if you haven't caught on yet, is referring to the loot, all the things that they've gathered and are going to take. Then we'll wait. Now I say ain't going any more than 2 hours before this rat breaks up and washes off down the river. See, he'll be drowned and won't have nobody to blame for it but his own self. I reckon that's a considerable sight better than killing him. I'm unfavorable to killing a man as long as you can get around it. It ain't good sense. It ain't good morals. Ain't I right? Morals? These guys don't appear to have any morals. Yes, I reckon you are. Let's suppose you don't break up and wash off. Well, we can wait the 2 hours anyway and see, can't we? All right then, come on. So they started and I lit out, all in a cold sweat, and I scrambled forward. It was dark as pitch there, but I said in kind and coarse whisper, Jim! And he answered up, right at my elbow with a sort of moan, and says, Quick, Jim, there ain't no time for fooling around and moaning. There's a gang of murderers in yonder, and if we don't hunt up their boat and set her drifting down the river so these fellows can't get away from the wreck, there's one of 'em going to be in a bad fix. But if we find their boat, we can put all of 'em in a bad fix, for the sheriff will get 'em. Quick, hurry! I'll hunt the larboard side, and you hunt the starboard, and you start the raft and... Oh, my lordy, lordy! Raft? There ain't no raft no more. She done broke loose and gone. And here we is. And that's where we end chapter 12. So you've got to consider here, Huck knows what's going to happen to these guys, or happen to the one guy, should these other two get a hold of him. They're going to make sure that he makes his way into the river and drowns. Huck considers, well, shoot, if we go ahead and unhitch their boat, all three of them are going to be stuck. Well, unfortunately, Jim's just reported that the raft that Huck and Jim had, it's long gone now. So this is a perfect moment for us to stop, make some predictions about what we're going to be reading next week, starting with chapter 13. If you get real eager and you want to read ahead, that's totally all right. Hope you guys are taking care of yourselves. Have a wonderful weekend. I'll catch you soon.